Hello and welcome back to SimonsRants. I'm Simon, and today I'll be going over the history of animation in American cinema. Now, the history of animation in American cinema is essentially just the history of Disney. They pioneered, dominated, and owned the competition for the majority of their history. It all began in 1937 when Walt Disney Studios released Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs into theaters. Now, animation had already been done in part in shorts, but this was the first time that a full-length feature film was released in theaters in the States. And aside from some early competition from the Fleischer Brothers, the creators of Betty Boop and two films, there was no real competition for decades. And despite often being compared to Warner Brothers, there wasn't much competition outside of their shorts. Warner Brothers actually didn't release their first feature-length film into theaters until 1993 with Batman: The Mask of Phantasm. So Disney was the premier animation studio because they were the only animation studio. After Fleischer Studios went defunct in 1942, there was not a single animated feature film released in theaters aside from Disney until 1954. And even then, that was Animal Farm, which was a bleak and rather adult film. In that time span, Disney released Bambi, Fun and Fancy Free, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Pan, without a single competitor putting forth a single feature film to combat against them. Disney's dominance continued on through the 70s into the 80s without any issue. There was an occasional competitor film put out, but nothing that hindered them from owning the market. That is until one of Disney's disgruntled head animators decided to leave the studio to go and create his own independent films. That head animator's name was Don Bluth. You might not know him by name, but you'll definitely know his works. Before leaving Disney, Bluth worked on Robin Hood, The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, The Rescuers, Pete's Dragon, and The Fox and the Hound. And his first independent film, The Secret of Nim, released in 1982. For the first time in the past 50 years, Disney had some actual competition. Along with Bluth's independent films, the 1980s also brought us feature-length films based off of TV shows, such as the Care Bears movie in 1985, the Transformers movie in 1986, and G.I. Joe the movie in 1987. Along with the added competition, Disney was now struggling to make up for the lack of Don Bluth. After Bluth left, they released a string of missteps known as the Dark Ages of Disney. This was highlighted by The Black Cauldron, which made only $21.3 million. Off of a $44 million budget. In the meantime, Don Bluth had released An American Tail in 1986 and The Land Before Time in 1988. For the first time in Disney's history, they weren't on top. However, on November 17th, 1989, the power shifted once again. Bluth went head-to-head with his old studio, opting to release a film on the exact same day. He released All Dogs Go to Heaven. Disney released The Little Mermaid. And like that, Disney regained their spot at the top heading into the 1990s. The 90s turned out to be a much different landscape in the animation market. There was a total of 34 animated feature films released in the 90s by 10 different studios. Disney may have been back on top, but there was now competition everywhere. The animation explosion only grew in the 2000s as there were 7 films released in the year 2000 alone. 4 of those 7 films, however, were released by Disney. Despite Disney's success in the first half of the decade, they were still struggling to pull away from the raised competition. This would lead to a new strategy that would define Disney from then on. If you can't beat them, join them. Or make them join you. And this all began in 2006 when Disney bought their first animation rival, Pixar. Now, Disney's desire to own Pixar goes back a lot further than most people realize, and it all began with a man named Joe Ranft. In 1987, Joe Ranft wrote a little film called The Brave Little Toaster. Despite working for Disney at the time, he chose to release it independently. A few years later, Ranft left Disney to go work for a studio called Pixar. Once there, he started reworking his classic script about a boy's appliances coming to life when no one was looking, and eventually released the movie Toy Story. Now, despite Pixar not being owned by Disney yet, they still had a contract with Disney. Disney was in complete control of their distribution. They got to decide when and where their films got released and got 50% of the profits. This was unfortunate for Pixar as Disney refused to let them have any releases during the summer. This decreased their ticket sales and also prevented them from having a VHS release in time for the holidays. This created a feud between the two studios which raged on for a couple of years before eventually Disney bought them out in 2006. So what would become of Ranft? Well, he actually died in 2005 in a car accident. So despite all of his attempts to keep his projects away from Disney, they own them now. And that leads us to the 2010s and now, where in 2018, 9 animated feature films were released, and this year, 15 more are expected. What once took us 20 years to get, we now get every year. But is the competition that once sparked Disney's renaissance still leading to better films, or is it just adding to the noise? With great films coming out like The Isle of Dogs and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, also comes Ugly Dolls and the Angry Birds movie 2. With results like that, it can be hard to tell if we're going the right direction or not. I feel as the competition grows, the amount of great movies that we get get also grows. Despite the amount of bad movies we get growing as well, we can leave those behind and focus on the good films. But only time will tell. What do you guys think? Is the oversaturated market hurting or helping the industry? Let me know in the comments below, and of course don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'm Simon from SimonsRants. Thanks guys, bye. Along with the added competition so despite what do you might think?